There are mornings when you wake up already exhausted by yourself. Not because the world attacked you, not because something terrible happened overnight, but because deep down you already know the truth. You are still trapped inside the same mind that has been holding you back for years. The same hesitation, the same weak negotiations with comfort, the same habits quietly destroying your future while you pretend there is still time. And perhaps the most painful part is not ignorance. It is awareness. You already know what must change. You know your distractions are stealing your life. You know your emotions control you too easily. You know discipline disappears the moment discomfort arrives. You know your potential is rotting beneath endless delay. Yet every morning, the same version of you wakes up and repeats the same patterns again. This is the silent suffering most people never speak about. The frustration of watching yourself betray your own future in slow motion. Most men think their life is being destroyed by bad luck, difficult people, lack of opportunity, or unfair circumstances. And yes, life can be cruel. Some wounds are real. Some betrayals leave scars that do not disappear easily. But the Stoic asks a harder question. What part of your suffering is being recreated by your own mind every single day? Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire, yet even he woke each morning preparing himself for weakness, anger, exhaustion, temptation, and emotional chaos. Think about that carefully. A man with power over Rome still understood that the greatest battle was not outside himself, it was inside himself. Because no amount of success can save a man who cannot govern his own mind. And no amount of external peace can help a person whose inner world is ruled by fear, laziness, resentment, and emotional dependence. This is where most people lose their lives, not in one dramatic failure, but in thousands of small moments where comfort becomes more important than character. Every time you delay the work that could change your future, every time you choose distraction over discipline, every time you stay silent out of fear, every time you let emotions speak before wisdom, every time you seek approval from people who have done nothing to deserve authority over your peace, you are shaping yourself quietly, repeatedly, permanently. Your future is not appearing out of nowhere. It is being built by what you tolerate daily. A weak mind creates a weak life. An undisciplined inner world creates external chaos. This is why two people can suffer the same hardship and become completely different human beings afterward. One becomes bitter, emotional, reactive, and broken by it. The other becomes calmer, wiser, stronger, more disciplined. The event was the same. The mind meeting the event was different. That is the truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Your life changes when the person living it changes, not when motivation appears, not when the world becomes easier, not when people finally understand you, and not when circumstances magically become perfect. A different future cannot be built by the same inner ruler. If fear rules you, your life will shrink around safety. If comfort rules you, your future will be traded for temporary ease. If validation rules you, your peace will always belong to strangers. If anger rules you, your relationships will burn before wisdom has a chance to speak. Most people never notice this because they spend their entire lives looking outward. They blame the economy, their childhood, their past relationships, their stress, their lack of time, their environment. And again, some of these things matter, but the Stoic refuses to surrender all responsibility to the outside world. Because the moment you believe everything is outside your control, you become powerless. Marcus Aurelius understood something most people never will. The first kingdom a man must rule is himself. Before you can lead a life, you must lead your own mind. Before you ask for peace, become someone capable of carrying peace without destroying it through insecurity. Before you ask for success, become someone disciplined enough to survive success without becoming weak. Before you ask for respect, become someone who no longer needs constant approval to feel valuable. This is the uncomfortable truth. Your current identity is producing your current life. Your habits are not random. Your reactions are not random. Your emotional patterns are not random. The person you repeatedly become each day is shaping everything around you. And until that inner pattern changes, your external life will continue repeating itself in different forms. This is why most people stay trapped for years. They try to change outcomes without changing the operator. They chase motivation instead of transformation. They want a new life while protecting the same mindset that created the old one. But Stoicism teaches something far more powerful. You do not rise by wishing for a better world. You rise by becoming stronger than the version of yourself that keeps pulling you backward. And that battle begins in silence. In the invisible moments nobody applauds. In the mornings where discipline must speak louder than emotion. In the moments where you stop asking how life can change and start asking who inside you must change first. Because the man you are becoming is being shaped right now, and most men never realize who is truly controlling them until it is too late. Most people believe their greatest enemy is outside them. They think the thing destroying their future is lack of opportunity, difficult circumstances, toxic people, bad luck, or the unfairness of life. But the Stoic sees something far more dangerous. The real enemy is the mind that has been quietly trained to keep repeating weakness. Long before your life became what it is today, your mind was being conditioned. Every repeated reaction became a lesson. Every emotional escape became a pattern. Every moment where comfort defeated discipline taught your brain what to do the next time discomfort appeared. And eventually, those repeated behaviors stopped feeling like choices. They started feeling like identity. This is why so many people stay trapped even when they desperately want change. They believe desire is enough. They think because they want discipline, they will become disciplined. Because they admire strength, they will become strong. Because they understand wisdom, they will naturally live wisely. But the mind does not obey admiration. The mind obeys repetition. Your brain learns from what you repeatedly practice, not from what you occasionally wish for. If every stressful moment leads you toward distraction, your mind learns that discomfort must be escaped. If every difficult conversation makes you emotionally reactive, your mind learns that anger is protection. If every moment of boredom sends your hand toward your phone, your mind learns that silence is unbearable. If every failure makes you seek approval from others, your mind learns dependence instead of self-respect. This is how weakness becomes automatic. Quietly, gradually, without you noticing. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. That is why he constantly returned to the same disciplines each morning. He knew the human mind naturally drifts toward comfort, ego, fear, and emotional chaos unless it is trained otherwise. The average person wakes up and immediately surrenders to impulse. They feel tired, so they avoid effort. They feel insecure, so they seek validation. They feel uncomfortable, so they escape into entertainment. They feel anger, so they obey it instantly. They never pause long enough to examine what is happening inside themselves. And because they never examine it, the pattern grows stronger. This is the terrifying thing about unconscious living. Repetition becomes destiny. A man who repeatedly avoids difficult work eventually calls himself lazy. A man who repeatedly fears rejection eventually calls himself socially anxious. A man who repeatedly escapes discomfort eventually calls himself unmotivated. But Stoicism teaches something harsher and more liberating. Most of what people call personality is simply conditioning repeated long enough to feel permanent. Think about how dangerous that is. Many people are not living as conscious human beings. They are living as programmed reactions. Stress appears, and the program says escape. Fear appears, and the program says avoid. Criticism appears, and the program says defend. Loneliness appears, and the program says seek validation. Boredom appears, And the program says, distract yourself immediately. They do not choose these reactions consciously anymore because the pathways have been strengthened through years of repetition. This is why change feels so difficult. You are not only fighting habits, you are fighting emotional conditioning that has been reinforced thousands of times. Your mind has learned weakness through repetition the same way a soldier learns discipline through repetition. And until you understand this, you will continue hating yourself for failing while never addressing the system producing the failure. Most people think transformation happens through motivation. It does not. Motivation is emotional weather. Training is identity construction. One emotional night will never overpower years of repeated conditioning. That is why people promise themselves change at midnight and return to the same life by morning. The conscious mind made a decision, but the deeper conditioning remained untouched. The old pathways were still alive. The old mental commands were still active. The old self was still running the system. This is why the Stoic focuses so heavily on awareness and repetition, because what is repeated becomes automatic. And what becomes automatic eventually becomes character. If you repeatedly obey comfort, comfort becomes your ruler. If you repeatedly obey fear, fear becomes your identity. If you repeatedly obey distraction, focus begins to feel painful. You can see this everywhere in modern life. People cannot sit in silence anymore. They cannot focus without stimulation. They cannot endure boredom without reaching for dopamine. They cannot face discomfort without escape. Their minds have been trained into fragility. And the worst part is that society rewards this weakness by normalizing it. Emotional impulsiveness is called authenticity. Laziness is called self-care. Endless distraction is called relaxation. Avoidance is called protecting your peace. But the Stoic sees through this illusion. He understands that every repeated act either strengthens the ruler within him or weakens it. Every small decision trains the mind in a direction. Every reaction becomes rehearsal for the future self. This is why discipline matters even in tiny moments nobody sees. Because the mind is always learning. Every time you choose distraction over focus, your brain remembers. Every time you surrender to emotional impulse, your brain remembers. Every time you break your word to yourself, your brain remembers. And eventually, the deeper part of you stops trusting your intentions altogether. This is where many men secretly lose respect for themselves. Not because they failed once, but because they repeatedly watch themselves abandon their own standards. The mind notices that betrayal. The soul remembers it. That is why confidence disappears. Because real confidence is not built through positive thinking. It is built when your actions repeatedly prove to your mind that you can be trusted under pressure. The frightening truth is that your current life is not random. It is the visible result of invisible repetitions. Your mind has been trained into the person you are today, which means if you want a different future, you cannot simply hope for better emotions. You must train a different mind, and most people never do, because they mistake conditioning for personality and call their prison who they are. One of the most dangerous lies a person can believe is this: because I thought it, it must be true. Most people spend their entire lives obeying the first thought that enters their mind. They never question it. They never examine it. They never create distance between themselves and the impulse. Anger appears, and they become anger. Fear appears, and they become fear. Insecurity appears, and suddenly their entire identity collapses around it. They live as servants to every emotion, every impulse, every passing mental reaction. But Stoicism teaches something completely different. The first thought is not always wisdom. Often, it is only conditioning speaking before reason has had time to stand up. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. He knew the human mind constantly produces impressions. Some arrive as anger, some arrive as fear, some arrive as jealousy, shame, pride, lust, insecurity, resentment, or self-hatred. But he also understood something most people never learn. An impression is not a command. A thought entering your mind does not automatically deserve obedience. This changes everything. Because the moment you stop identifying with every thought, you begin reclaiming control over your life. Most men are not destroyed by reality. They are destroyed by unexamined reactions to reality. Someone criticizes them, and instantly the mind says, defend yourself, attack back, protect your ego. Someone else succeeds, and instantly the mind says, you are falling behind. You are not enough. A difficult task appears, and instantly the mind whispers, avoid it. Do it later. You will probably fail anyway. The average person obeys these thoughts automatically because they arrive quickly and feel emotionally real. But speed is not the same as truth. The first response is often only the oldest response. It is the mind repeating what it has practiced for years. That is why Stoicism places such enormous importance on the pause between impulse and action. Inside that pause lives freedom. A weak man reacts instantly. A disciplined man observes first. There's a massive difference between feeling anger and becoming controlled by anger. There's a massive difference between feeling fear and allowing fear to decide your actions. The Stoic does not try to eliminate emotion completely. He trains himself not to become owned by it. This is where mental strength truly begins. Not when emotions disappear, but when emotions stop becoming your master. Think about how many lives are ruined by first reactions. Relationships destroyed because anger spoke too quickly. Opportunities abandoned because fear arrived first. Years wasted because comfort convinced someone to wait for motivation. Entire identities shaped by thoughts that were never questioned. Most people assume that because a thought feels powerful, it must be correct. But pain often speaks in absolutes. You always fail. Nobody respects you. You will never change. You are too late. You are not capable. The wounded mind loves dramatic certainty. Marcus Aurelius warned himself constantly against becoming a prisoner to these inner impressions. He knew that the soul becomes dyed by the color of its thoughts. And if you allow every dark impulse to paint your inner world, eventually you begin living inside emotional chaos without even realizing it. This is why awareness matters so much. The moment you notice a thought instead of instantly obeying it, something powerful happens. You separate yourself from the impulse. You stop being fused with the reaction. Instead of saying, I am angry, you begin saying, anger is present. Instead of saying, I am weak, you begin saying, weakness is trying to speak. Instead of saying, I am afraid, you begin saying, fear is here, but fear does not decide my actions. This may sound small, but psychologically, it changes everything, because language shapes identity. Most people strengthen destructive emotions by turning them into personal truth. They build permanent identities around temporary mental states. Stoicism breaks this illusion. It teaches that thoughts are visitors, not rulers. A visitor may enter your mind loudly, but that does not mean it deserves authority over your behavior. Imagine how different life becomes once you understand this. Criticism arrives, but you pause before reacting. Fear arrives, but you continue forward anyway. Shame arrives, but you refuse to build your identity around it. Distraction arrives, but you return your attention to the work. This is how self-command is built, quietly, repeatedly, in tiny moments invisible to everyone else. Most people think freedom means doing whatever they feel like doing. The Stoic sees freedom differently. True freedom is not being enslaved by every feeling that enters your body. If your emotions completely control your actions, then you are not free. You are being governed internally by impulse. Marcus Aurelius understood that discipline begins in the invisible space between stimulus and response. That space is where character is forged. Because your first thought may reveal your conditioning, but your second thought reveals your character. The first thought is often inherited from fear, memory, ego, pain, or repetition. The second thought is where wisdom has a chance to speak. The first thought says, run. The second thought says, stand firm. The first thought says, seek approval. The second thought says, respect yourself first. The first thought says, escape discomfort. The second thought says, this discomfort is training you. This is the battle most people never realize they are fighting. They think life is happening around them, when in reality the deepest war is happening within them every hour of the day. A war between impulse and discipline, between emotion and reason, between the old self and the person they could become. And the terrifying truth is that whatever wins these tiny invisible battles eventually becomes your destiny, because every time you obey the higher response instead of the automatic one, you weaken the old pattern. You carve a new road into the mind, slowly, painfully, repeatedly, until one day, the thought that once controlled you loses its authority completely. And that is the moment your real life begins. One of the quietest tragedies in human life is how quickly people turn their wounds into identity. They repeat a behavior long enough, suffer inside it long enough, and eventually stop saying, this is something I struggle with, and begin saying, this is who I am. That sentence destroys more futures than failure ever could. Because the moment a person mistakes conditioning for identity, they stop fighting for change. They stop questioning the pattern. They stop imagining another way to live. And slowly, the prison becomes home. Marcus Aurelius understood that the human mind constantly creates stories about itself. Some of those stories strengthen the soul. Others quietly chain it. A man fails repeatedly and begins saying, I'm just not disciplined. Another gets hurt emotionally and begins saying, I can't trust anyone. Another spends years overthinking and eventually says, I'm just an anxious person. Another constantly seeks approval and calls it being caring or loving. But Stoicism asks a brutal question. Is this truly your nature or only a path you have walked too many times? Most people never ask themselves this honestly. They inherit an old reaction, repeat it for years, then crown it as personality. Fear becomes identity. Laziness becomes identity. Emotional weakness becomes identity. Avoidance becomes identity. And because identity feels permanent, they stop imagining transformation altogether. This is how the mind traps itself, not through chains you can see, but through language repeated silently every day. I'm just bad with discipline. I've always been like this. I'm not confident. I'm too emotional. I'm not built for hard things. The more those sentences are repeated, the deeper they sink into the subconscious. Eventually, the mind no longer hears them as opinions. It hears them as laws. And once a person believes weakness is their nature, they begin unconsciously defending the very habits destroying them. This is why some people become strangely loyal to their suffering. Change threatens the identity they have built around pain. If they stopped overthinking, who would they be? If they stopped needing approval, how would they relate to people? If they stopped hiding behind distraction, they would finally have to face themselves directly. Most people fear that confrontation more than they fear staying miserable. That is why transformation feels dangerous. Not because growth is impossible, but because growth requires the death of an old identity. Marcus Aurelius constantly fought against this inside himself. He never assumed that because anger appeared, he was an angry man. He never assumed that because fear appeared, fear deserved authority. He understood that Impulses arise naturally inside the human mind, but he refused to kneel before them simply because they arrived. This is the difference between a disciplined person and an unconscious one. The unconscious person says, "This feeling is me." The disciplined person says, "This feeling is visiting me." One becomes enslaved by emotion, the other examines it. Think about how many destructive identities modern people carry without question. Someone calls themselves lazy after years of obeying comfort, but perhaps they are not lazy. Perhaps they have simply trained themselves to escape discomfort repeatedly. Someone calls themselves emotionally weak, but perhaps they were never taught how to sit with pain without running from it. Someone calls themselves socially anxious, but perhaps years of self-rejection trained them to fear judgment automatically. Stoicism does not deny these struggles. It simply refuses to call them destiny, because once you label a pattern as permanent identity, you unconsciously stop searching for another way forward. The road becomes invisible. This is why language matters so much. A person who says, "I am broken," lives very differently from someone who says, "I am wounded but trainable." A person who says, "I am weak," behaves differently from someone who says, "Weakness has been practiced, but it can also be unlearned." Most people never realize how heavily their inner language shapes their future. The deeper mind is always listening. Every repeated label becomes instruction. And eventually the subconscious begins organizing behavior around whatever identity has been accepted. If you repeatedly call yourself weak, the mind begins protecting weakness. If you repeatedly call yourself hopeless, the mind stops looking for solutions. If you repeatedly call yourself undisciplined, the mind stops expecting obedience from itself. This is why the Stoic guards inner speech carefully. Not because he believes in fake positivity, but because he understands that identity shapes action, and action shapes destiny. There is another dangerous part of the identity trap. Sometimes your destructive patterns were originally created to protect you. Avoidance may once have protected you from shame. Emotional numbness may once have protected you from pain. People-pleasing may once have protected you from rejection. Anger may once have protected you from feeling powerless. But what once protected you can later imprison you. A shield carried too long becomes a burden. A wall built for safety eventually becomes a cage. Many people spend their adult lives obeying survival strategies created by a younger version of themselves. And because those reactions feel familiar, they mistake familiarity for truth. But Marcus Aurelius would remind you that the soul is not measured by its first impulse, it is measured by what it chooses to strengthen. Character is built intentionally. Identity is trained repeatedly. The old self survives through unconscious repetition. And most men secretly defend the very identity that is destroying their future because at least it feels familiar. But Stoicism demands something harder. It demands that you stop worshiping your old wounds as personality. It demands that you stop confusing repetition with destiny. It demands that you look directly at your habits, fears, and emotional patterns and ask one terrifying question. Is this truly who I am, or only who I have practiced becoming? Because the moment you realize your identity has been trained, another truth appears beside it. If it was trained once, it can be trained again. Change does not begin with motivation. It begins with seeing. This is the part most people avoid because awareness is uncomfortable. It forces you to stop blaming the world long enough to confront the machinery operating inside your own mind. Most people say they want discipline, peace, confidence, focus, emotional control. But very few are willing to observe the hidden patterns destroying those things every day. They want transformation without self-examination. They want a new life while remaining unconscious to the behaviors creating the old one. But Stoicism begins differently. The Stoic watches himself carefully. Marcus Aurelius did not write as a man pretending he had mastered the human condition. He wrote as a man studying the human condition within himself every single day. He watched irritation rise. He watched pride demand attention. He watched comfort negotiate against duty. He watched emotional impulses attempt to seize control of his judgment. And because he watched them honestly, he slowly weakened their authority. This is where power truly begins. The moment you can observe a pattern instead of blindly becoming it, something changes inside you. Awareness creates distance, and distance creates choice. Most people live completely fused with their reactions. Anger appears, and they instantly become anger. Fear appears, and they instantly obey it. Jealousy appears, and they instantly compare themselves to others. They never pause long enough to say, what exactly is happening inside me right now? This is why unconscious people remain trapped for decades, because what is not observed cannot be corrected. You cannot defeat a pattern you refuse to look at directly. This is why the Stoic treats self-observation as a form of inner warfare. Not harsh self-hatred, not endless guilt, but disciplined honesty. The ability to look clearly at your mind without lying to yourself. Most people cannot do this. The ego protects itself by renaming weakness. Laziness becomes self-care. Avoidance becomes protecting your peace. Emotional impulsiveness becomes authenticity. Fear becomes realism. Bitterness becomes intelligence. The mind is extremely skilled at decorating its chains so they look acceptable. Awareness strips away those decorations. It says, no, look carefully. Stop romanticizing the pattern. Stop defending what is destroying you. This is painful because awareness threatens the old self. The unconscious version of you survives through automatic behavior. It survives through distraction, emotional speed, and constant avoidance of reflection. But the moment you begin observing yourself honestly, the old machinery becomes visible. You start noticing how quickly your mind seeks comfort when discomfort appears. You start noticing how badly your ego wants approval. You start noticing how often anger is really insecurity wearing armor. You start noticing how many of your decisions are driven by fear instead of wisdom. This is not weakness. This is awakening. Marcus Aurelius understood that awareness must come before transformation because a man cannot govern a kingdom he refuses to inspect. And your mind is exactly that, a kingdom. Most people abandon their inner world entirely. They allow random thoughts, emotional impulses, social pressure, distractions, and external noise to govern them freely. Then they wonder why they feel exhausted, fragmented, anxious, and lost. But the Stoic becomes an observer before becoming a ruler. He learns the terrain of his own mind first. He studies the moments where he loses himself. He studies the situations that trigger weakness. He studies the emotional wounds still controlling his reactions. This is why awareness is power. Because once a pattern becomes visible, it can no longer operate with complete invisibility. Think about the moments where you suddenly catch yourself. You notice the urge to procrastinate before acting on it. You notice anger rising before the words leave your mouth. You notice the hunger for validation before abandoning your dignity for approval. Those moments matter more than most people realize. Because in that instant, you are no longer fully unconscious. You are no longer being dragged blindly by impulse. A space has opened between you and the reaction, and inside that space lives freedom. At first, this awareness may arrive late. You may notice the emotional reaction only after it already controlled you. You may notice distraction after an hour has already disappeared. You may notice insecurity only after seeking reassurance from someone who never deserved authority over your peace. But even late awareness is still progress. The unconscious man never notices at all. He simply calls every reaction who I am. The Stoic understands something deeper. He understands that awareness grows through repetition. The more honestly you observe yourself, the earlier you begin catching the pattern. First after the reaction, then during the reaction. Eventually, before the reaction fully takes control, that is how mastery begins. Slowly, quietly, through observation repeated over time. This is why Marcus constantly returned to self-examination. He knew the mind naturally drifts toward unconsciousness unless it is watched carefully. A person who never examines himself becomes easy to control by emotions, by society, by fear, by pleasure, by approval, by distraction. But a person who develops awareness becomes dangerous to his old patterns, because now the old self cannot hide as easily anymore. Now comfort gets exposed during negotiation. Now fear gets exposed before retreat. Now ego gets exposed before emotional reaction. This is why awareness feels uncomfortable at first. It removes illusion. It forces you to see the exact places where your life is leaking away. But this discomfort is sacred, because you cannot heal what you continue hiding from yourself. You cannot rebuild your character while remaining unconscious to what is destroying it. Awareness is the torch carried into the dark rooms of the mind. And most people spend their entire lives avoiding those rooms because they're afraid of what they will find there. But the Stoic walks inside anyway, calmly, honestly, without self-pity, because he knows something most people never understand. The moment you can say, "This pattern is happening inside me," is the moment you are no longer completely owned by it. And that is where real power begins. Most people imagine transformation as something dramatic. They think change arrives like lightning, one powerful realization, one emotional breakthrough, one perfect morning where suddenly they become disciplined, focused, calm, and unstoppable. But real transformation is far less exciting than people want it to be. It is quiet, repetitive, often invisible. Character is not built in grand public moments. It is built in the small, private moments where nobody is watching, and you still choose what is difficult over what is comfortable. This is why so few people truly change. They admire discipline emotionally, but they never train it practically. Marcus Aurelius understood that philosophy meant nothing if it could not survive ordinary life. Wisdom was not proven while reading noble ideas in silence. Wisdom was proven when insult arrived, when exhaustion arrived, when temptation arrived, when boredom arrived, when nobody would have punished weakness except your own conscience. That is where character becomes real. Most people fail because they treat discipline like emotion instead of structure. They wait to feel motivated before acting. They wait to feel confident before speaking. They wait to feel ready before beginning. But the Stoic understands something deeper. If you only act when emotions cooperate, then emotions become your master. Discipline begins the moment you stop negotiating with every feeling that appears inside you. The weak mind constantly bargains with discomfort. I'll start tomorrow. I'm too tired today. Just one more distraction. I need to feel inspired first. I deserve a break. The mind says these things so often that eventually the person no longer notices the negotiation happening. Comfort becomes automatic authority. And slowly, the future gets sold away in tiny, invisible pieces. This is why discipline is built in moments that appear small from the outside. Waking up when comfort says, stay in bed. Returning to the work when distraction pulls your attention away. Remaining silent when anger wants your tongue. Refusing to seek validation when insecurity feels unbearable. Beginning the task before motivation arrives. These moments seem insignificant individually, but together they shape the architecture of your character. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that a human being was made for action, not endless emotional negotiation. He understood that comfort weakens the soul when obeyed constantly, not because comfort itself is evil, but because a life ruled by comfort slowly destroys inner authority. Every time you repeatedly ignore your own standards, the mind notices. The deeper part of you remembers each betrayal. This is why so many people secretly lose respect for themselves. They promise discipline but repeatedly obey impulse. They promise focus but repeatedly surrender attention. They promise courage but repeatedly retreat from discomfort. Eventually, the subconscious stops trusting their words entirely. Real confidence does not come from affirmations. It comes from evidence. The mind must repeatedly see you act with strength before it believes strength is real. This is why small, disciplined actions matter so much psychologically. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, even in tiny ways, you strengthen internal trust. Every time you choose discomfort voluntarily, you weaken fear's authority. Every time you return to the work instead of escaping into distraction, you remind the mind that you are still capable of command. The ordinary day becomes training ground for the soul. Most people underestimate how much their future is hidden inside their daily reactions. The way you respond when tired matters. The way you behave when frustrated matters. The way you act when nobody is watching matters. Because identity is not built through intention. It is built through repeated behavior. A man who repeatedly acts with discipline eventually becomes disciplined. A man who repeatedly acts with restraint eventually becomes calm. A man who repeatedly chooses courage eventually stops seeing fear as authority. But this process feels unnatural at first. The old self resists change because the old pathways are familiar. Calm feels slower than anger. Discipline feels heavier than comfort. Focus feels harder than distraction. Silence feels weaker than emotional reaction. That resistance is normal. The Stoic does not panic because the old impulse still appears. He expects resistance. Marcus Aurelius did not become mentally strong because he eliminated struggle. He became mentally strong because he stopped expecting virtue to feel easy immediately. He trained himself to act correctly even when emotion argued against it. This is where most people quit. They do the right thing once or twice, then become discouraged when the old pattern returns. They think the presence of temptation means failure. But temptation is not proof that you are weak. Temptation is proof that training is still happening. Every difficult moment is an opportunity to strengthen self-command. The rude person trains your patience. The delay trains your perspective. The fear trains your courage. The boredom trains your focus. The temptation trains your discipline. Nothing is wasted when used correctly. The Stoic sees ordinary life as a school for inner strength. This changes the entire way you experience difficulty. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin asking, "What part of me is this training?" Suddenly, life stops feeling purely hostile. The challenge becomes material for transformation. The obstacle becomes resistance, against which character is strengthened. Like iron shaped under repeated pressure, the soul becomes stronger through friction. But friction only transforms the person willing to remain conscious during it. Most people escape discomfort before growth can happen. They reach for dopamine immediately, they numb themselves immediately, they distract themselves immediately, and because they constantly escape resistance, they never develop internal strength. A muscle never challenged becomes weak. The same is true for the mind. This is why discipline is not one decision. It is a relationship with discomfort. The disciplined person does not eliminate pain from life. He stops allowing pain to automatically control his behavior. Slowly, through repetition, a new identity begins forming. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, privately, one choice at a time. One restrained reaction at a time. One completed task at a time. One moment of courage at a time. until eventually the old self begins losing authority, and the person you once had to force yourself to become starts feeling natural. Because the future version of you is being trained in the invisible moments you once believed did not matter. Repetition is the part of transformation almost nobody respects. People admire intensity, they admire dramatic moments, they admire sudden breakthroughs and emotional speeches that make them feel powerful for one night. But the Stoic understands something deeper. A man is not changed by what inspires him once. He is changed by what he repeats when inspiration disappears. This is why most people stay trapped in cycles for years. They rely on emotion to create change, but emotion is unstable. One day they feel motivated, the next day they feel empty again. One night they promise themselves discipline. The next morning, comfort takes control again. Their identity rises and falls with temporary feelings because they never understood the true mechanism of transformation. Repetition is what rewires the soul. Marcus Aurelius understood this completely. That is why he returned to the same truths over and over again in his writings. He reminded himself daily that anger was beneath him, that praise was temporary, that death was near, that duty mattered more than comfort. Some people look at repetition and think it means weakness. But Marcus repeated these principles because he understood training. A soldier does not become skilled by lifting a sword once. A blacksmith does not shape iron with one strike. And the human mind does not transform through one emotional realization. It transforms through repeated exposure to disciplined action. Most people dramatically underestimate how much repetition shapes identity. Every repeated thought strengthens a pathway. Every repeated emotional reaction deepens conditioning. Every repeated behavior teaches the subconscious what to expect from you in the future. This is why repetition can either enslave you or free you. If you repeatedly obey distraction, focus becomes harder. If you repeatedly obey fear, courage begins to feel unnatural. If you repeatedly seek validation, self-respect weakens. If you repeatedly surrender to comfort, discipline starts feeling impossible. The mind learns from what you consistently do, not from what you occasionally admire. This is why your habits slowly become your character. The frightening thing about repetition is that it operates whether you are conscious of it or not. Every day you are rehearsing a version of yourself. Every reaction is training. Every excuse is training. Every act of restraint is training. Every moment of courage is training. The soul is always learning from what you repeatedly allow. This is why the Stoic treats ordinary actions with such seriousness. Because ordinary actions repeated long enough eventually become identity. Most people think they are making isolated choices. They do not realize they are carving roads into the mind. A single act means little. Repeated acts become pathways. And pathways eventually become automatic behavior. Imagine a forest untouched by human movement. The first walk through it is difficult. The ground resists your steps. But if you walk the same route every day, eventually a visible path appears. The mind works the same way. Repeated thoughts create mental roads. Repeated emotional reactions create automatic patterns. Repeated discipline creates inner strength. Repeated weakness creates dependence. The path you walk most often becomes the path your mind chooses automatically. This is why the old self keeps returning so easily. Those roads have been walked for years. Anger has been rehearsed. Fear has been rehearsed. Avoidance has been rehearsed. Self-doubt has been rehearsed. Comfort has been rehearsed. And most people become discouraged when the old impulses still appear. They think transformation is failing because temptation remains. But the Stoic expects resistance. Marcus Aurelius did not become calm because anger disappeared forever. He became calm because he repeatedly chose restraint until restraint became stronger than reaction. This is how repetition rewires identity. Not instantly, gradually, like water carving stone over time. At first, the new behavior feels unnatural. Discipline feels heavy. Silence feels uncomfortable. Patience feels weak. Courage feels dangerous. But the more often you repeat the higher action, the more familiar it becomes to the mind. Eventually, the new road strengthens while the old road weakens from disuse. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. A person who practices one small discipline every day changes more deeply than someone who waits for dramatic motivation once a month. The Stoic understands that greatness is hidden inside ordinary repetition. The way you speak to yourself every morning matters. The way you respond to frustration matters. The way you behave when exhausted matters. The way you return after failure matters, because repetition is collecting evidence about who you are becoming. Each disciplined action whispers to the subconscious, this is who we are now. Each act of courage whispers, fear no longer rules us. Each act of restraint whispers, impulse is no longer king. This is how inner authority is built quietly. Through repetition, no one applauds. The blacksmith does not strike iron once and expect transformation. He strikes again and again while the metal resists. The iron heats, cools, bends, and slowly changes shape under repeated pressure. Your mind is no different. The old impulses are the rough metal. Your repeated choices are the hammer. Attention is the fire. Discipline is the shaping force. And character is what slowly emerges through repeated pressure over time. Most people quit before repetition has a chance to transform them. They become impatient. They want immediate evidence. They want instant identity change. But the Stoic understands that the deepest forms of transformation are initially invisible. You may repeat disciplined actions for weeks before the inner world begins to feel different. You may repeatedly resist distraction before focus feels natural. You may repeatedly practice emotional restraint before calmness becomes stable. But every repetition matters even when results are not visible yet, because the soul remembers what you practice. This is why Marcus Aurelius kept returning to the same principles day after day, not because he was weak, but because he understood that repetition shapes destiny. Most men unknowingly repeat weakness until weakness becomes identity. The Stoic repeats strength until strength becomes automatic. One path leads deeper into unconscious living, the other slowly builds a ruler within, and eventually something extraordinary happens. The action that once required enormous effort begins to feel natural. The discipline you once forced becomes part of your character. The emotional reaction that once controlled you loses its speed. The fear that once paralyzed you loses authority. Not because life became easier, but because repetition built a stronger mind to meet life differently. This is the quiet miracle of disciplined repetition. It slowly turns conscious effort into unconscious strength. And one day people look at your calmness, your discipline, your focus, your emotional control, and assume you were simply born that way. They never see the thousands of invisible repetitions that built it. But the Stoic knows character is not born in one moment. Character is carved through repetition until the soul itself begins to remember a higher way of living. Most people believe their emotions are telling them the truth. That is why they obey them so quickly. Anger feels justified, so they speak without restraint. Fear feels convincing, so they retreat before trying. Insecurity feels real, so they beg for approval from people who never earned authority over their peace. They do not realize that emotions are often temporary storms pretending to be permanent wisdom. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. He knew the human mind constantly produces emotional reactions, but he refused to treat every reaction as sacred. This is one of the clearest differences between a disciplined person and an unconscious one. The unconscious person is ruled from within. His emotions decide his behavior before reason has a chance to speak. The Stoic may still feel anger, fear, envy, shame, loneliness, frustration, and temptation, but he no longer automatically bows before them. He understands something most people never learn. Emotions are visitors. They are not kings. A visitor may enter loudly, a visitor may disturb the room, a visitor may demand attention, but a visitor does not deserve the throne. Most people hand over the throne immediately. One insult controls their entire day. One rejection destroys their confidence. One failure convinces them they are worthless. One emotional wound shapes their identity for years. They live emotionally exposed to the world because they never developed inner sovereignty. Everything external gains authority over them. Praise lifts them. Criticism breaks them. Attention excites them. Silence terrifies them. Comfort weakens them. Difficulty crushes them. They are emotionally governed by whatever enters the room first. Marcus Aurelius refused to live this way. He understood that emotional reactions are part of being human, but emotional obedience is a choice. This is why he constantly reminded himself to examine impressions before accepting them as truth. He knew that emotions arrive quickly and speak with confidence. Anger says, attack now. Fear says, retreat immediately. Pride says, protect your ego. Envy says, you are falling behind. Shame says, hide yourself. Comfort says, you can delay again. But the Stoic slows the process down. He creates space between feeling and action, and inside that space, reason begins reclaiming authority. Most emotional suffering becomes destructive because people never pause long enough to examine what they are feeling. They become fused with the emotion instantly. They say, I am angry, I am anxious, I am broken, I am worthless. But Stoicism reframes this completely. It teaches that emotions are experiences passing through you, not definitions of who you are. The moment you say anger is present, instead of I am anger, the relationship changes. The moment you say fear is here, but fear is not my ruler, your mind begins separating identity from impulse. This distinction is everything, because most people unconsciously worship emotion. They believe whatever they feel in the moment must be acted upon immediately. Modern culture even encourages this weakness. People are told to express every feeling instantly, to react without restraint, to mistake impulsiveness for authenticity. But Marcus Aurelius would see this as slavery. A mind completely controlled by emotional weather can never become stable. Emotional sovereignty does not mean becoming cold or emotionless. It means emotions stop owning your behavior. The Stoic still feels deeply, but he does not surrender judgment to temporary emotional storms. This is where true mental strength begins. Not in pretending you feel nothing, but in refusing to let emotions drag your life in random directions. Think about how many people destroy themselves because they cannot sit with discomfort. They cannot tolerate boredom, so they drown themselves in stimulation. They cannot tolerate loneliness, so they chase shallow validation. They cannot tolerate criticism, so they become defensive and emotional. They cannot tolerate uncertainty, so they seek control over everything around them. Their lives become endless emotional reactions because they never learn stillness. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to calm self-command because he knew emotional speed weakens wisdom. Anger depends on speed. Fear depends on immediacy. Shame depends on silence. Impulse depends on unconsciousness. But the moment you slow down and observe the emotion directly, much of its power begins collapsing. Fear becomes smaller when examined carefully. Anger becomes weaker when denied immediate action. Temptation becomes less convincing when viewed from the perspective of long-term consequence. This is why emotional control is not suppression, it is examination. The Stoic does not bury emotion blindly. He studies it. He asks, what exactly is this feeling trying to make me do? Does this emotion deserve authority? Will obeying this feeling strengthen my character or weaken it? These questions interrupt unconscious behavior. Most people never ask them. They simply react. And reaction repeated long enough becomes personality. This is why emotional discipline is so rare now. Modern life trains impulsiveness constantly. Instant entertainment, instant validation, instant outrage, instant stimulation. People are becoming emotionally fragile because they have lost the ability to remain internally steady when discomfort appears. But the Stoic becomes dangerous precisely because he develops stability in a world addicted to emotional chaos. Imagine the power of becoming someone who does not collapse every time life becomes difficult. Someone who can feel fear without retreating, feel anger without becoming destructive, feel insecurity without begging for validation, feel discomfort without escaping immediately. That is inner sovereignty. That is self-command. Marcus Aurelius understood that the world itself would always remain unpredictable. Difficult people would exist. Delays would exist. Pain would exist. Betrayal would exist. Exhaustion would exist. But he refused to let every external event dictate the condition of his inner world. Most people spend their entire lives trying to control the world outside themselves because they never learned to govern the world within. The Stoic reverses this completely. He understands that real power begins internally. The calm mind sees clearly while the emotional mind reacts blindly. And eventually this changes the entire quality of your life. You stop becoming owned by every passing feeling. You stop giving temporary emotions permanent authority. You stop building identity around emotional storms. The emotion still arrives, but now there is a ruler awake inside the mind, watching, examining, choosing carefully what deserves action and what deserves silence. This is why the Stoic becomes steady while others become consumed by emotional noise. He understands something most people never will. Emotions may enter the kingdom, but they do not sit on the throne. Marcus Aurelius did not begin his mornings by hoping life would be gentle with him. He began by preparing his mind for the fact that it would not be. This alone separates the Stoic from most people. The average person wakes up mentally unguarded. Before they have even chosen who they want to become that day, the world has already entered their mind. Notifications enter first. Stress enters first. Anxiety enters first. Social comparison enters first. One small inconvenience ruins their mood. One difficult message controls their attention. One emotional reaction poisons the next several hours. They begin the day already surrendered to external forces because they never prepared their inner world before the noise arrived. Marcus understood how dangerous this was. He knew that a person who does not prepare his mind in advance will be ruled by whatever appears first. So every morning he practiced mental preparation, not fantasy, not empty positivity, preparation. He reminded himself that he would meet difficult people, delays, disrespect, selfishness, temptation, fatigue, and frustration. But he did not do this to become cynical. He did it so reality would not surprise him emotionally. This is one of the deepest forms of strength. Most suffering is intensified by resistance to reality. People secretly expect life to cooperate with their desires. They expect everyone to understand them. They expect plans to unfold smoothly. They expect effort to always be rewarded immediately. And when reality breaks those expectations, they collapse emotionally because they were psychologically unprepared. The Stoic removes this weakness before the day even begins. He understands that life contains friction by nature. Difficult people exist, delays exist, misunderstanding exists, exhaustion exists, temptation exists, loss exists. But once you stop being shocked by these things, they lose much of their emotional power over you. Preparation gives authority back to the soul. Think about how differently you move through life when your mind is prepared beforehand. Criticism arrives, but you expected misunderstanding. Temptation appears, but you already decided discipline mattered more than comfort. Fatigue appears, but you already accepted that duty often feels heavy. the emotional shock disappears. Because the mind was trained before the test arrived. This is why Marcus Aurelius constantly rehearsed hardship mentally. He knew preparation strengthens judgment. Most people wait until anger is burning inside them before deciding whether they want to be calm. They wait until distraction appears before deciding whether focus matters. They wait until fear arrives before deciding whether courage is necessary. By then, the emotional impulse already has momentum. The Stoic trains before the battle begins. A soldier does not sharpen his sword in the middle of combat. A disciplined mind does not begin training itself only after chaos has entered the room. This is why morning preparation is so powerful psychologically. It establishes internal leadership before the world begins negotiating with your emotions. Most people unknowingly allow the external world to set the emotional tone of their entire day. If something pleasant happens, they feel strong. If something frustrating happens, they feel weak. Their inner state constantly shifts based on circumstances outside their control. But Marcus Aurelius understood that a person without inner preparation becomes emotionally available to everything. Every insult gains access. Every delay gains power. Every inconvenience becomes personal. The Stoic closes those gates before the day begins. He reminds himself, I may meet difficulty today, but difficulty will not govern my character. This is what creates steadiness. Not controlling the world, but preparing the mind that must meet the world. Imagine waking up each morning and deciding in advance who you will be before life tests you. Before the criticism arrives, you choose patience. Before temptation arrives, you choose restraint. Before fear arrives, you choose courage. Before exhaustion arrives, you choose duty. Suddenly, life stops dictating your identity moment by moment. You begin carrying an internal standard into the world instead of allowing the world to constantly reshape you emotionally. This is what most people are missing. They are reactive instead of prepared. Their emotions remain completely exposed to circumstance because they never trained their minds in advance. Marcus Aurelius would sit quietly with himself each morning and remember the kind of person he intended to be when reality became difficult. He knew that if he failed to establish internal order early, external chaos would quickly take command. Modern life makes this even more important. The world is designed to fragment your attention now. Notifications, endless stimulation, outrage, comparison, emotional manipulation, instant gratification. If you do not consciously prepare your mind each day, your attention will be consumed by external noise before your own principles even have a chance to speak. Most people wake up and immediately lose themselves. The Stoic wakes up and remembers himself first. This is why solitude matters in the morning. Silence matters. Reflection matters. The quiet moments before the world enters your mind are where you decide whether you will remain internally governed or emotionally conquered for the rest of the day. Marcus Aurelius understood that the first battle each morning was not external productivity. It was internal alignment. Who will rule your mind today? Fear or reason? Comfort or discipline? Ego or wisdom? Distraction or focus? Most people never ask these questions consciously. They simply drift into unconscious reaction the moment the day begins. But the Stoic chooses intentionally before the world begins pressuring him emotionally. This changes the entire quality of your life because preparation weakens emotional surprise. And emotional surprise is where most people lose control of themselves. A person who expects life to always feel comfortable becomes fragile. A person who mentally rehearses difficulty becomes resilient. This does not make the Stoic pessimistic. It makes him ready. There is enormous power in being psychologically prepared for discomfort before it appears. The insult hurts less. The delay frustrates less. The temptation weakens. The emotional storm, because the mind already knew such moments would come. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson Marcus Aurelius understood. Mental strength is not built by controlling reality. Mental strength is built by preparing the soul that must face reality every single day. Slowly, through repetition, you become someone harder to shake. Not because life becomes easier, but because your inner world stops collapsing every time life refuses to cooperate. And one day you realize something extraordinary. The world still contains noise, chaos, temptation, and difficulty, but now there is a ruler awake at the gate. At some point, a man becomes tired of being controlled by himself, tired of the excuses, tired of the emotional chaos, tired of watching potential decay beneath comfort, distraction, fear, and endless hesitation. And eventually, he reaches a moment where something inside him quietly changes. He stops asking life to become easier. He decides to become stronger instead. This is the beginning of self-governance. Marcus Aurelius understood that the greatest victory in life was never domination over others. It was domination over the weaker parts of yourself, over anger, over fear, over ego, over laziness, over emotional impulsiveness, over the endless inner voice constantly pulling you away from discipline and toward comfort. Most people spend their entire lives trying to control the external world because they cannot control their internal one. They chase status to hide insecurity. They chase validation to quiet self-doubt. They chase pleasure to escape emptiness. They chase distraction to avoid silence. But no external achievement can permanently free a person who remains internally ruled by weakness. This is why some people gain success and still feel lost, because the outer life changed while the inner ruler remained the same. Stoicism begins where performance ends. It asks a deeper question. Who governs your mind when nobody is watching? That is your true identity. Not your image, not your words, not your ambitions, but the force inside you making decisions in private moments. The version of you that appears when temptation arrives, when difficulty appears, when exhaustion appears, when pain appears. This is the self you must learn to govern. Most people never do because self-governance is difficult. It requires awareness when unconsciousness feels easier. It requires discipline when comfort feels inviting. It requires restraint when emotion demands reaction. It requires responsibility when blame feels safer. The weak mind constantly searches for escape routes. The Stoic closes those routes one by one. He stops allowing emotion to justify weakness. He stops allowing comfort to negotiate away his future. He stops allowing fear to make decisions on behalf of his potential. Slowly, a new internal authority begins forming. Not loud, not arrogant, quiet, stable, dangerous. This is what real strength looks like. Most people think power is aggression. The Stoic understands that the strongest mind is often the calmest one. The man who can remain steady under pressure. The man who does not collapse emotionally every time life becomes difficult. The man who can sit alone without needing constant stimulation. The man who can feel fear without obeying it. The man who can endure discomfort without escaping into distraction. That is power. Because a person who governs himself becomes difficult for the world to control. Marcus Aurelius knew this. That is why he repeatedly returned to inner discipline instead of external obsession. He understood that the world itself would always remain unstable. People would disappoint him. Circumstances would change. The body would age. Loss would arrive. Death would arrive. But if the inner world remained disciplined, then external chaos could no longer completely destroy the soul. This is why Stoicism is ultimately about freedom. Not freedom to indulge every impulse, freedom from being enslaved by impulse altogether, freedom from emotional dependency, freedom from unconscious living, freedom from needing constant approval, Freedom from becoming owned by fear, anger, distraction, comfort, and external validation. Most people never reach this freedom because they remain divided inside themselves. One part wants growth. Another part worships comfort. One part wants discipline. Another part seeks escape. One part wants peace. Another part keeps feeding emotional chaos. This internal division drains the soul constantly. But the Stoic slowly creates alignment. Thought begins aligning with action. Values begin aligning with behavior. Discipline begins aligning with identity. Eventually, there is less inner conflict because the higher self has gained authority over the lower impulses. This transformation does not happen in one dramatic moment. The old self rarely disappears all at once. It fades through repeated disobedience. Every time you refuse to obey fear, the old self weakens. Every time you resist emotional impulse, the old self weakens. Every time you choose discipline over comfort, the old self weakens. Every time you remain conscious instead of reactive, the old self loses territory. And slowly, almost invisibly, another version of you begins emerging, stronger, calmer, harder to shake, more disciplined, more self-respecting, more internally free. This is why repetition mattered so much. This is why awareness mattered so much. This is why emotional restraint mattered so much. Because every one of those practices was building a ruler inside the mind, a ruler capable of governing the kingdom within. Most people never realize that the mind itself can become either a prison or a kingdom. If your thoughts constantly control you, it becomes a prison. If your emotions constantly dominate you, it becomes a prison. If your habits repeatedly betray your future, it becomes a prison. But when awareness grows, when discipline strengthens, when emotional mastery develops, the inner world slowly transforms into something else entirely. A place of order instead of chaos, a place of strength instead of dependency, a place where external events no longer completely dictate your peace. Marcus Aurelius understood that this inner kingdom was the only possession no one could truly take from him. Empires fall, bodies weaken, reputation changes, wealth disappears, but character remains. The disciplined mind remains. The governed soul remains. And perhaps this is the final truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You are becoming something every single day, whether you realize it or not. Your habits are shaping you. Your reactions are shaping you. Your thoughts are shaping you. Your repetitions are shaping you. The question is not whether transformation is happening. The question is in what direction? Toward unconsciousness or awareness, toward weakness or discipline, toward emotional slavery or self-command, toward comfort or strength. The old self will continue asking for ease. It will continue asking for delay. It will continue asking for escape. But you no longer have to obey it, because now there is another voice inside you, quieter but stronger. The voice that understands discipline. The voice that chooses awareness. The voice that no longer wants temporary comfort at the cost of a wasted life. And one day, after enough repetition, enough restraint, enough conscious decisions, you will look back at the person you used to be and realize something extraordinary. The old self is no longer your ruler.